Subscribe to STORYLAB for more stories. Now, let's begin this one. Chapter 1. Grease and Gears. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Fleming's auto repair, its golden light filtering through the grimy windows onto the concrete floor where Rodney Fleming lay beneath a 1998 Chevy Silverado. The steady ping of cooling metal mixed with the distant hum of traffic on Route 47, creating the soundtrack of his new life. One he'd chosen after 15 years of calculating threat vectors and mapping escape routes for the most powerful man in the world. "Dad, the alternator on Mrs. Henderson's Honda is ready," called 16-year-old Melody Fleming from the office doorway. Her voice carried the same steady confidence that had once earned Rodney commendations from 3 different presidential administrations. She wore her dark hair in a practical ponytail, and motor oil stained her jeans, evidence of the after-school hours she spent learning the trade that had become their family's anchor. Rodney slid out from under the truck, his weathered hands finding the red shop rag he always kept in his back pocket. At 48, he still maintained the lean build and alert posture of his Secret Service days, though grease had replaced gun oil under his fingernails. The transition from protecting presidents to fixing transmissions hadn't been easy, but Willow Creek, Missouri, offered something Washington never could: anonymity and peace. "Tell Mrs. Henderson it'll be ready by 5, he said, checking his watch. "And Mel? Good catch on that bearing noise yesterday. Most mechanics would have missed it." Melody beamed at the praise. She'd inherited her father's analytical mind, though she applied it to compression ratios instead of security protocols. "Mom's making her famous pot roast tonight. Think you can finish up here?" Before Rodney could answer, the growl of a high-performance engine shattered the garage's tranquility. Through the bay doors, a midnight blue Mustang GT skidded into the parking lot, its tires leaving black marks on the asphalt. The car sat low and aggressive, equipped with aftermarket modifications that probably cost more than most families in Willow Creek made in 6 months. The driver's door swung open, and Benjamin Yates stepped out. At 19, he possessed the particular brand of arrogance that came from never facing consequences. His blonde hair was perfectly styled, his clothes expensive, and his smile carried the cruel edge of someone who'd learned early that rules were for other people. The Yates name opened doors in Willow Creek, and closed them just as quickly. "Hey, Grease Monkey," Benjamin called out, his voice echoing through the garage. "This piece of shit truck is blocking my spot." Rodney straightened slowly, his instincts, honed by years of threat assessment, immediately cataloging details. Benjamin's pupils were dilated despite the bright afternoon light, suggesting chemical enhancement. His movements carried the loose-limbed confidence of someone under the influence. Most telling was the way he positioned himself: squared shoulders, chin raised, hands loose at his sides in a fighter's stance. "This is my shop," Rodney replied evenly. "All the spots are my spots." Benjamin's laugh was sharp and ugly. "You know who my father is?" "Can't say I care." The words hung in the air like smoke from burning oil. Benjamin's face darkened, his jaw working as he processed the unfamiliar experience of being dismissed. In Willow Creek, the Yates name commanded instant deference. Sheriff Reginald Yates had run the county with an iron fist for 12 years, and his son had grown accustomed to the privileges that power provided. "Maybe you should care," Benjamin said, taking a step closer. "Maybe you should. Ben, come on." The voice belonged to Carlos Allison, Benjamin's latest passenger. Carlos emerged from the Mustang's passenger side, clearly uncomfortable with the developing confrontation. "We're going to be late for the party." But Benjamin wasn't finished. His eyes had found Melody, who stood frozen in the office doorway. Something predatory flickered across his features as he took in her work clothes and defensive posture. Well, Benjamin drawled. "What do we have here?" Rodney felt the familiar cold settle in his chest, the same ice-water calm that had once served him during 3 separate assassination attempts on foreign soil. His daughter was in potential danger, and every instinct he developed over 15 years in federal service began firing in sequence. "Melody, go inside," he said quietly, but Benjamin was already moving, crossing the garage with the lazy confidence of a predator approaching cornered prey. "Don't be shy, sweetheart. I'm sure Daddy's told you all about the real world, but maybe it's time you learned firsthand." What happened next unfolded in the space between heartbeats. Benjamin reached out, his fingers aiming for Melody's arm. She stepped back, her heel catching on the office threshold. As she fell, Benjamin grabbed for her, his hand closing around her forearm with enough force to stop her fall and enough to snap the radius bone with a sound like breaking kindling. Melody's scream cut through the afternoon air like a blade. The world shifted into the crystalline focus Rodney remembered from his operational days. Time seemed to dilate as Benjamin released Melody's arm and stepped back, his face registering surprise rather than remorse. Carlos was already moving toward the car, clearly wanting no part of what he'd witnessed. Melody crumpled to her knees, cradling her injured arm against her chest, tears streaming down her face. Rodney's first impulse was to close the distance between himself and Benjamin Yates in 3 swift steps and introduce the young man's throat to his forearm. 15 years of close-quarters combat training could end this threat in seconds. But another part of his mind, the part that had kept presidents alive, was already calculating consequences. Sheriff's son, small town, his family's safety. Instead, he knelt beside his daughter, his hands gentle as he examined her arm. The break was clean but obvious, the bone displaced enough to require immediate medical attention. Melody's face was pale with shock, her breathing rapid and shallow. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "We're going to get you to the hospital." Benjamin was backing toward his car now, but his expression showed more annoyance than concern. "She should have been more careful," he said with a shrug. "Maybe next time she'll watch where she's going." The casual dismissal of his daughter's pain lit something dark and fundamental in Rodney's mind. This wasn't just an accident. It was a glimpse into a worldview where consequences didn't exist for people named Yates. "You broke her arm," Rodney said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone stating an irrefutable fact. "Prove it," Benjamin replied, climbing into his Mustang. "And good luck with that." The engine roared to life, and within seconds, Benjamin Yates was gone, leaving only the smell of burning rubber and the sound of his daughter's quiet sobbing. As Rodney helped Melody to her feet and guided her toward his truck, his mind was already working. 15 years in the Secret Service had taught him many things, but perhaps the most important was this: every system had vulnerabilities. Every person who believed themselves untouchable had blind spots, and Rodney Fleming had spent his entire career learning how to find them. Chapter 2, The Call. Dr. Martinez finished wrapping Melody's cast with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been setting bones for 20 years. The emergency room at Willow Creek general bustled with the controlled chaos of a Thursday evening. But the orthopedic wing maintained an almost library-like quiet broken only by the soft squeak of nurses' shoes and the distant hum of fluorescent lights. 6 to 8 weeks, Dr. Martinez said, securing the final layer of fiberglass. "The break is clean, which is good news. No surgery required, but she'll need physical therapy once it heals." Melody nodded, her face still pale, but her composure returning. She'd inherited more than just her father's analytical mind. She possessed the same steely resilience that had carried him through hostile territory in 3 different continents. "Will I be able to work on cars again?" "Eventually, yes, though I'd recommend avoiding heavy lifting for a while." Dr. Martinez turned to Rodney. "Any idea how this happened?" The question hung in the sterile air like an accusation. Rodney had spent the past 3 hours wrestling with exactly how much truth to reveal. In his previous life, incident reports were classified documents filed through secure channels. Here in Willow Creek, a broken bone meant police reports and insurance claims, paper trails that could complicate everything. "Accident at the shop," he said finally. "She caught her heel and fell wrong." Dr. Martinez nodded, making notes on his tablet. He'd been treating the residents of Willow Creek long enough to recognize when families prefer to handle things privately. "Well, accidents happen. Just make sure she keeps the cast dry and follows up in 2 weeks." As they left the hospital, Melody walked beside her father in comfortable silence. The parking lot was nearly empty, the Missouri evening settling around them with the promise of autumn's arrival. Street lights created pools of yellow illumination that reminded Rodney uncomfortably of the security perimeter lighting he'd once specified for outdoor events. "Dad," Melody said as they reached the truck. "You know, it wasn't really an accident." Rodney paused, his hand on the door handle. His daughter's directness was both blessing and curse. She saw through deception with the same clarity she applied to engine diagnostics. "I know. Benjamin Yates did this on purpose." "I know that too." She was quiet for a moment, processing. "What are you going to do about it?" The question cut straight to the heart of everything. In Washington, Rodney had operated within clearly defined parameters. Threats were neutralized through official channels, backed by the full authority of federal law enforcement. Here in Willow Creek, those channels led directly through Sheriff Reginald Yates, Benjamin's father and the architect of a power structure that had insulated his family from consequences for over a decade. "Let's get home," Rodney said instead of answering. "Your mother's probably worried sick." The drive back to the Fleming house took them through downtown Willow Creek, past the courthouse where Sheriff Yates held court and the cluster of businesses that comprised the town's economic heart. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where 3 generations of families attended the same church, and where the high school football team's success dictated the collective mood each Friday night. It was also the kind of place where men like Reginald Yates could build kingdoms. Their house sat on Maple Street, a modest 2-story colonial that Rodney had purchased with his Secret Service pension. The front porch light was on, and through the living room window, he could see Joanne Fleming pacing by the phone. His wife of 20 years possessed the particular brand of strength that came from being married to a man whose job had required him to consider his own mortality on a daily basis. She'd weathered deployments, threat assessments, and the constant low-level stress of protecting America's first family without complaint. But nothing had prepared her for the call about her daughter's broken arm. "Rodney," Joanne met them at the door, her relief palpable as she gathered Melody into a careful embrace. "How bad is it?" "Clean break," Melody said, holding up her casted arm like a badge of honor. "Dr. Martinez says I'll be fine." Joanne's eyes found Rodney's over their daughter's head, and he saw the questions there, the same questions he'd been asking himself for the past 3 hours. His wife had never asked him to abandon the analytical thinking that had made him successful in federal service, but she'd hoped their move to Missouri would mean applying those skills to safer problems. "Let's get you settled," Joanne said, guiding Melody toward the living room. "I kept dinner warm." As his family disappeared into the kitchen, Rodney remained in the entryway, his mind involuntarily cataloging details with the same thoroughness he'd once applied to venue security. The deadbolt was engaged. The security system he'd installed, military-grade, far beyond what anyone in Willow Creek would consider necessary, showed green across all zones. The sightlines from the street were blocked by the oak tree he'd specifically chosen not to trim. Old habits died hard. The phone rang at exactly 9:17 p.m., its shrill tone cutting through the quiet domestic scene like a fire alarm. Rodney was helping Melody with her homework at the kitchen table while Joanne finished cleaning dishes. All 3 of them froze at the sound. Late evening calls in small towns usually meant emergencies. Rodney answered on the 3rd ring. "Fleming residence." The voice on the other end was deep and confident, carrying the particular authority that came from years of command. "Mr. Fleming? This is Sheriff Reginald Yates. I understand there was an incident at your shop today involving my son." The words were casual, conversational, but Rodney's trained ear caught the undertone of threat. He'd heard that same tone from dictators and crime bosses, men who'd grown accustomed to having their problems disappear through intimidation. "Sheriff," Rodney replied, his voice neutral. "What can I do for you?" "Well, I'll be honest with you, Mr. Fleming. Benjamin came home pretty upset tonight. Says your daughter had some kind of accident at your shop, and he's worried you might blame him somehow." The rewriting of history was so blatant, so casually delivered, that Rodney felt his jaw tighten. "Is that what he told you?" "Benjamin's a good boy, Mr. Fleming. Maybe a little high-spirited, but he's got a bright future ahead of him. Football scholarship to Missouri State next fall. It would be a real shame if false accusations derailed all that potential. The threat was clear now, delivered with the smooth confidence of someone who'd never faced opposition. Rodney glanced at Melody, who was watching him with the intense focus she usually reserved for complex engine problems. His daughter was smart enough to understand that this conversation would determine more than just the next few weeks. It would set the tone for how they lived in Willow Creek. "Sheriff," Rodney said carefully, "my daughter has a broken arm. That's not an accusation. It's a medical fact." The laugh that came through the phone was harsh and ugly. "Accidents happen, Mr. Fleming, especially to families that don't understand how things work in small towns. See, I've been sheriff here for 12 years, and in that time, I've learned something important. This county runs smooth when everyone understands their place." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Rodney could feel his wife and daughter watching him, waiting to see how their husband and father would respond to naked intimidation. "And what place would that be, Sheriff?" "Well, now, that depends entirely on how smart you are. Smart people in Willow Creek mind their own business. They understand that sometimes good families have bad accidents, and they know better than to go looking for trouble where none exists." Rodney's free hand found the edge of the kitchen counter, his knuckles whitening as his grip tightened. 15 years of diplomatic training warred with more primitive instincts as he fought to keep his voice level. "I see. I hope you do, Mr. Fleming, because the alternative is that you're not as smart as I thought, and that would be unfortunate for everyone involved." The line went quiet for a moment, filled only with the soft static of the connection. When Sheriff Yates spoke again, his voice carried the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "I own this town, Mr. Fleming. The mayor, the city council, the county prosecutor, they all understand how things work here. Your daughter's accident was just that, an accident. And if you're smart, that's exactly how it'll stay in everyone's memory." Rodney closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 15 years' worth of operational planning settling across his shoulders like a familiar coat. In his mind, he could see the threat matrix taking shape, the same kind of systematic analysis he'd once applied to protecting motorcades and securing venues. "And if I'm not smart, Sheriff?" The pause that followed was pregnant with menace. "Well, Mr. Fleming, accidents have a way of multiplying in small towns, especially for families that don't fit in. Businesses can fail. People can find themselves unwelcome. Children can discover that schools aren't as safe as their parents hoped." The threat to Melody crystallized everything. Rodney opened his eyes and found his daughter watching him with the same steady gaze she'd inherited from her mother. She was scared but not broken, hurt but not defeated. In that moment, he realized that the most important thing he'd ever protected wasn't a president or a policy. It was sitting right there at his kitchen table. "I understand perfectly, Sheriff. I'm glad to hear it. Have a good evening, Mr. Fleming, and give my regards to your family." The line went dead, leaving Rodney standing in his kitchen with the phone in his hand and the sound of his heartbeat in his ears. For a moment, the only sound was the soft tick of the wall clock and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Then Melody spoke, her voice carrying the same steady certainty she'd used to diagnose engine problems since she was 12 years old. "He threatened us." It wasn't a question. Joan moved closer, her hand finding Rodney's arm as she processed what she'd overheard. His wife had lived through enough late-night calls during his Secret Service years to recognize the sound of danger. "What do we do?" Joan asked quietly. Rodney set the phone back in its cradle with the careful precision of someone handling explosive ordnance. His mind was already shifting into operational mode, cataloging resources and identifying objectives with a methodical thoroughness that had once earned him commendations from 3 different presidential administrations. "We do what we've always done," he said finally. "We protect our family." But even as he spoke the words, another part of his mind was working. The part that had spent 15 years learning that the most effective defense was often a carefully planned offense. Sheriff Reginald Yates had just made the critical error that brought down dictators and crime bosses throughout history. He'd revealed his hand while underestimating his opponent. In the morning, Rodney would return to Fleming's auto repair and resume his role as the town's quiet mechanic. But tonight, for the first time in 5 years, he was thinking like an agent again. And agents, he remembered, were very good at finding vulnerabilities. Chapter 3. Research and Reconnaissance. The Willow Creek Public Library occupied a converted Carnegie building on Main Street, its sandstone facade and tall windows offering a deceptively peaceful contrast to the digital warfare Rodney Fleming was preparing to wage from its computer terminals. At 6:47 a.m., he was the library's first visitor, arriving even before Marilyn Webster, the head librarian who'd been opening the doors at precisely 7 a.m. for the past 8 years. "You're early this morning, Mr. Fleming," Marilyn observed as she disabled the alarm system. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her wire-rimmed glasses caught the morning light streaming through the entrance. "Everything all right?" "Research project," Rodney replied, which was technically true. "Thought I'd get a head start before the shop opens." Marilyn nodded, understanding the value of quiet concentration. She'd noticed that their newest resident possessed the particular focus of someone accustomed to complex problems, though she assumed his intensity came from business planning rather than operational analysis. The computer terminal in the library's reference section was older than the classified systems Rodney had used in Washington, but it would serve his purposes. As the machine hummed to life, he began the methodical process of information gathering that had once helped him secure presidential visits to hostile territories. Sheriff Reginald Yates had been in law enforcement for 18 years, the last 12 as Willow Creek County's elected sheriff. His official biography read like a study in small-town ambition. Local high school graduate, 2 years at Missouri State, military service with the Army National Guard, deputy sheriff, and finally the top job. On paper, he appeared to be exactly what voters wanted, a hometown boy who'd returned to protect and serve. But Rodney's training had taught him to look beyond official narratives. The first red flag appeared in the property records. In 2018, Reginald Yates had purchased a $340,000 house on 15 acres outside town, a significant upgrade from his previous modest home on Elm Street. The down payment had been $85,000 cash, which represented more than Sheriff Yates' entire annual salary after taxes. The second anomaly was in the campaign finance reports. Yates' last election campaign had raised $47,000, an unusual amount for a county sheriff position that typically saw unopposed candidates spending less than $5,000. The donor list included several out-of-state contributors and 3 limited liability companies with no obvious connection to Willow Creek. Rodney made notes on a yellow legal pad, his handwriting as precise as the technical diagrams he'd once drawn for motorcade routes. Each detail was cataloged and cross-referenced, building a picture that went far beyond simple corruption. Finding everything you need, Rodney looked up to find Marilyn Webster approaching with a steaming cup of coffee. The library was still officially closed, but she'd noticed his intense focus and decided to extend the kind of professional courtesy she reserved for serious researchers. "Yes, thank you. I'm trying to understand some local history. Anything specific? I've lived here my whole life. Might be able to point you in the right direction." Rodney considered his options. Marilyn Webster struck him as the kind of person who noticed everything and forgot nothing. Exactly the type of local resource he'd once cultivated in foreign countries. "The Yates family," he said carefully. "I'm trying to understand their role in the community." Marilyn's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the change so subtle that only someone trained in reading micro-expressions would have caught it. Her smile remained in place, but her eyes grew cautious. "Well," she said slowly, "Reginald's family has been here for 3 generations. His father was a deputy sheriff, and his grandfather owned a farm north of town. And the current sheriff? Reginald's been effective in his position." The careful word choice spoke volumes. Crime rates have stayed low, and he's maintained good relationships with state law enforcement. Rodney nodded, recognizing the diplomatic language people used when they wanted to avoid saying something directly. "What about his son, Benjamin?" The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Marilyn's jaw tightened, and her hand gripped the coffee cup with enough force to whiten her knuckles. "Benjamin is spirited," she said finally. "Young men sometimes take time to find their direction." "I see." Marilyn glanced around the empty library, then leaned closer. "Mr. Fleming, I don't know what your interest is in the Yates family, but I will say this. Some questions are better left unasked in small towns." After Marilyn retreated to her desk, Rodney continued his digital excavation. The next layer of information came from state motor vehicle records, which revealed that Benjamin Yates had accumulated 14 traffic citations in the past 2 years, all dismissed or reduced to minor infractions. The pattern suggested either extraordinary legal representation or systematic intervention by someone with influence over the judicial process. A deeper search revealed more troubling details. 3 different women in the past 18 months had filed complaints against Benjamin Yates with various state agencies, 2 for harassment, 1 for assault. All 3 complaints had been withdrawn before formal charges were filed, and all 3 women had subsequently left Willow Creek County. Rodney felt the familiar cold settle in his chest, the same ice-water calm that had once served him during high-threat operations. The picture emerging from his research wasn't just about corruption or abuse of power. It was about a systematic pattern of intimidation designed to protect a predator. By 9:30 a.m., when Rodney locked up Fleming's auto repair and drove to the county courthouse, he possessed a working understanding of how Sheriff Reginald Yates maintained control over Willow Creek County. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Economic pressure, legal manipulation, and strategic intimidation, all wrapped in the comforting fiction of small-town law and order. The courthouse occupied a full city block on Jefferson Street, its neoclassical architecture lending an air of permanent authority to the business conducted within. Rodney had visited similar buildings in dozens of countries, and he'd learned that the most important information was rarely found in official files. Instead, he walked to Della's Diner across the street. Della Baker had been serving coffee and gossip to courthouse employees for 15 years, which made her establishment the unofficial intelligence hub of Willow Creek County. Rodney ordered black coffee and took a seat at the counter, positioning himself where he could observe and listen. The morning crowd consisted mainly of county employees grabbing breakfast before work. Their conversations provided a real-time assessment of the local power structure, and within 30 minutes, Rodney had identified 3 potential sources of information. The first was Deputy Van Andrews, a 26-year-old officer who'd joined the sheriff's department straight out of the police academy. Van's body language suggested someone under constant stress. His eyes darted nervously around the diner, and he kept checking his phone as if expecting bad news. More importantly, he sat alone despite being surrounded by colleagues, which indicated either personal problems or professional isolation. The second was Caitlin Berger, a court clerk who'd been with the county for 8 years. Her conversations with other employees revealed frustration with recent changes to case scheduling and evidence handling procedures. She also made several references to irregularities that had been overlooked by senior staff. The third was Carlos Allison, the same young man who'd been in Benjamin Yates' car during yesterday's incident. Carlos worked part-time for the county maintenance department while attending community college, and his demeanor suggested someone carrying a significant burden of guilt. Rodney finished his coffee and left exact change on the counter. As he walked back to his truck, he was already formulating an approach strategy. The techniques he'd once used to develop intelligence assets in hostile territories could be adapted for civilian use. It was simply a matter of identifying motivation and providing the right incentives. His phone buzzed with a text message from Joanne, Melody asking when she can come back to the shop. Feeling better today. The message reminded him why he was conducting this analysis. His daughter's broken arm wasn't just a personal injury. It was a demonstration of power designed to establish dominance and discourage resistance. In his previous career, such demonstrations were called shaping operations, preliminary actions intended to influence an opponent's decision-making process. Sheriff Reginald Yates had initiated a shaping operation against the Fleming family, but he made a critical error in his threat assessment. He'd assumed his opponent was a simple mechanic rather than someone who'd spent 15 years learning how to dismantle exactly this kind of power structure. As Rodney drove back to Fleming's auto repair, his mind was already working through the operational phases of his response. Intelligence gathering was nearly complete, and he'd identified multiple potential assets within the target's organization. The next phase would require careful cultivation and strategic positioning. Sheriff Yates believed he owned Willow Creek County. Within 2 weeks, Rodney intended to prove him wrong. But first, he needed to understand exactly how a sheriff's son could drive down a one-way alley and never come out. Chapter 4: Building the Network. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and cooling metal as Rodney Fleming walked through downtown Willow Creek at 6:15 a.m. Main Street was deserted except for delivery trucks and the occasional early commuter, but Rodney wasn't interested in the visible activity. His attention was focused on the patterns he'd observed over the past week, the quiet rhythms that revealed how power actually flowed through the county. He'd learned that Deputy Van Andrews stopped at Murphy's gas station every morning at 6:22 a.m., purchasing coffee and a breakfast sandwich before his shift began. The young officer's routine was precise to the minute, suggesting either military background or obsessive personality traits. Either way, it represented an opportunity. Rodney arrived at Murphy's 3 minutes early and positioned himself at the coffee station, appearing to wrestle with the complicated choices offered by a self-serve machine that had clearly seen better days. When Van Andrews entered, Rodney was perfectly positioned for what intelligence professionals called a natural encounter. "Excuse me," Rodney said as Van approached the coffee station. "Any idea which of these actually tastes like coffee?" Van looked up from his phone, taking in Rodney's were clothes and grease-stained hands. Recognition flickered across his features. The deputy had obviously been briefed about the new mechanic in town. "The dark roast's your best bet," Van replied cautiously. "Everything else tastes like flavored water." "Thanks. You're Deputy Andrews, right? I think you brought your cruiser by my shop last month for an oil change." The mention of professional contact seemed to relax Van slightly. "Fleming's auto repair, yeah. You did good work." He paused, then added, "Sorry about your daughter. Heard she had an accident." The comment was carefully neutral, but Rodney caught the emphasis on the word accident. Van Andrews knew exactly what had happened to Melody Fleming, and his word choice suggested he didn't entirely believe the official version. "Kids," Rodney said with a shrug. "Always getting into trouble." Van nodded, but his expression remained troubled. As they walked toward the checkout counter, Rodney made his first strategic move. "Must be tough being a deputy in a small town. Probably see a lot of complicated situations." The reaction was immediate and telling. Van's jaw tightened, and his eyes flicked nervously toward the security camera positioned above the cash register. "Most days are pretty routine." "I imagine they are." They completed their purchases in silence, but as they reached the parking lot, Van Andrews made a decision that confirmed Rodney's assessment of his character. "Mr. Fleming," the deputy said quietly, "if you ever need anything, professional advice, you can find me at the Rusty Anchor most nights after 10. Just saying." The Rusty Anchor was a bar on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where off-duty law enforcement went to forget about their day. Van's invitation was carefully phrased, but the message was clear. He was willing to talk, away from official channels and electronic surveillance. "I'll keep that in mind, Deputy. Thanks for the coffee recommendation." Phase 1 of asset recruitment was complete. 2 days later, Rodney found himself in the automotive section of Henley's hardware store, ostensibly shopping for brake fluid, but actually conducting surveillance on his second potential source. Caitlin Berger lived in an apartment above the store and worked part-time for Henley's to supplement her court clerk's salary, information he'd gathered through careful observation of her daily routine. "Can I help you find something?" Rodney turned to find Caitlin approaching with a helpful smile. Up close, she appeared younger than her 28 years, but her eyes held the particular wariness of someone who'd seen too much bureaucratic corruption. "Brake fluid for a '97 Honda Civic," he said. "The good stuff, not the generic brand." As Caitlin led him to the correct aisle, Rodney initiated contact with the same casual professionalism he'd once used to develop sources in foreign countries. "You work at the courthouse too, don't you?" I think I saw you when I was getting my business license renewed. Court clerk's office, Caitlin confirmed. Oh, I spend more time here than I'd like to admit. County pay doesn't exactly cover the bills. The opening was perfect. Rodney had learned from his financial research that several courthouse employees worked second jobs, a common situation that created vulnerabilities and potential pressure points. Small-town economics, he agreed. I imagine you see a lot of interesting cases come through the court system. Caitlin's expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. Some more interesting than others. I bet. Must be frustrating when the interesting ones don't go the way they should. The comment was deliberately ambiguous, allowing Caitlin to interpret it however she chose. Her response would indicate whether she was simply a dissatisfied employee or someone with specific knowledge about judicial irregularities. You could say that, she replied carefully. Then, after glancing around the empty aisle, she added, funny how some cases just disappear from the docket, almost like they never happened. Bingo. Caitlin Berger had direct knowledge of case manipulation within the court system, and she was clearly troubled by what she'd witnessed. Rodney filed the information away while maintaining his casual demeanor. Bureaucracy's funny that way, he said. Sometimes things fall through the cracks. Sometimes, Caitlin agreed. And sometimes they get pushed. After purchasing his brake fluid, Rodney lingered in the hardware store's parking lot, ostensibly checking his phone, but actually watching Caitlin through the store window. Her body language had changed after their conversation. She moved with the nervous energy of someone who'd said more than intended, but felt relief at finally speaking the truth. Asset number 2 was position for development. The third phase of his recruitment strategy required a different approach entirely. Carlos Allison was young, guilt-ridden, and closely connected to Benjamin Yates, which made him both valuable and dangerous. Direct contact was impossible, but Rodney had identified an indirect route through Carlos's grandmother, Juanita Owens. Mrs. Owens attended St. Mark's Catholic Church every Tuesday morning for rosary prayers, and she volunteered at the church's food bank every Thursday afternoon. More importantly, she'd raised Carlos after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12, which meant she possessed both maternal authority and intimate knowledge of his current struggles. Rodney had never been particularly religious, but he'd attended enough diplomatic functions to understand the social dynamics of faith communities. On Thursday afternoon, he arrived at St. Mark's with a box of canned goods and the humble demeanor of someone seeking to serve rather than take. "Bless you for coming," said Juanita Owens as she directed him toward the sorting tables. "We can always use extra hands." At 72, Mrs. Owens possessed the quiet dignity of someone who'd survived genuine hardship without losing her compassion for others. She moved through the food bank with practiced efficiency, organizing donations and coordinating volunteers with the skill of a natural leader. "I'm new in town," Rodney explained as he began sorting canned vegetables. "Thought I should try to give back to the community." "That's wonderful. We don't get many new volunteers." She paused, studying his face with the sharp attention of someone accustomed to reading character. "You're the mechanic, aren't you?" "Rodney Fleming." "Yes, ma'am. I heard about your daughter. Such a shame about her accident." The words were spoken with genuine sympathy, but Rodney detected an undertone of something else, perhaps suspicion about the circumstances. Mrs. Owens had lived in Willow Creek long enough to recognize when official stories didn't match reality. "Kids heal fast," he replied diplomatically. They worked in comfortable silence for several minutes before Mrs. Owens spoke again. "I worry about young people these days. So much pressure, so many bad influences. My grandson Carlos has been struggling lately. Won't tell me what's wrong, but a grandmother knows." The opening was exactly what Rodney had hoped for. Teenage years are difficult. Must be hard to watch him struggle. He's not a teenager anymore. He's 20, old enough to make his own decisions, but still young enough to make terrible mistakes. She paused in her sorting, her weathered hands resting on a can of green beans. "I think he's gotten involved with the wrong crowd. Rich boys who think rules don't apply to them." "The Yates boy?" Mrs. Owens looked up sharply, her dark eyes assessing Rodney with new intensity. "You know Benjamin?" "We've met." The simple answer seemed to satisfy her need for caution. After a moment, she nodded slowly. "That boy is trouble. Has been since he was small. But Carlos won't listen to me anymore. Thinks money and connections are more important than character. Sometimes people need to learn hard lessons. And sometimes they need help learning them. Mrs. Owens resumed her sorting, but her voice carried new resolve. Carlos is a good boy underneath all the confusion. If he had the right guidance, the right encouragement, he might find his way back to doing what's right. The conversation established the foundation for indirect influence over Carlos Allison. Mrs. Owens was clearly troubled by her grandson's association with Benjamin Yates, and she possessed both the moral authority and emotional leverage to guide his decisions when the time came. That evening, Rodney sat in his study reviewing the intelligence he'd gathered over the past 2 weeks. His notebook contained detailed profiles of 23 individuals connected to the Yates family's power structure, along with comprehensive assessments of their loyalties, vulnerabilities, and potential value as intelligence sources. The picture that emerged was both encouraging and sobering. Sheriff Reginald Yates had built his control through systematic corruption and intimidation, but his network contained multiple weak points. Several county employees were troubled by what they'd witnessed, but afraid to speak out. Others were actively seeking ways to resist, but lacked the knowledge or resources to act effectively. Most importantly, Rodney had identified the critical vulnerability that would allow him to dismantle the entire structure: Benjamin Yates himself. The sheriff's son was reckless, arrogant, and protected by a father who believed his power was absolute. Benjamin's pattern of escalating criminal behavior, combined with his father's reflexive cover-ups, had created exactly the kind of overconfidence that brought down seemingly untouchable figures throughout history. Rodney closed his notebook and walked to the kitchen, where Joanne was helping Melody with her physical therapy exercises. His daughter's cast would come off in 3 weeks, but her broken arm had already served its purpose. It had revealed the true nature of the threat facing their family and provided the justification for everything that would follow. "How's it feeling, sweetheart?" he asked, watching Melody flex her fingers with determined concentration. "Better every day. Dr. Martinez says I'm healing faster than expected." She looked up with the same steady gaze that reminded him why he'd left Washington in the first place. "I've been thinking about what happened, Dad. About Benjamin Yates. Oh, he's going to hurt someone else. Someone who doesn't have a father who knows how to protect them." The observation cut straight to the heart of everything. Melody had inherited more than just his analytical mind. She possessed the same moral clarity that had originally drawn him to federal service. She understood that their family situation was part of a larger pattern of abuse that would continue until someone with the ability to stop it chose to act. "You're probably right," Rodney agreed. "So what are we going to do about it?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Joanne looked up from the therapy instructions, her expression indicating that she'd been wondering the same thing. His wife had lived through enough classified operations to recognize when her husband was in planning mode. "We're going to make sure Benjamin Yates faces consequences for his actions," Rodney said finally. "Real consequences, delivered through channels that his father can't control or influence." "Legal channels?" Joanne asked. Rodney considered the question carefully. Sheriff Yates had demonstrated that local law enforcement was completely compromised and the state agencies operated too slowly to prevent further victims. Traditional legal remedies would be ineffective against someone with systematic control over the judicial process. "Justice doesn't always come through courtrooms," he said. "Sometimes it requires more creative approaches." Melody nodded with the satisfaction of someone who'd reached the same conclusion through independent analysis. "Good, because people like Benjamin Yates don't stop until someone makes them stop." As his family returned to their evening routine, Rodney walked back to his study and opened his notebook to a fresh page. Phase 1 of his operation, intelligence gathering and asset recruitment, was nearly complete. Phase 2 would require more direct action, but first he needed to understand the tactical environment that would determine his operational parameters. Specifically, he needed to survey the one-way alley where Benjamin Yates would eventually take his final wrong turn. Chapter 5: The Perfect Storm. The narrow alley behind Murphy's gas station represented everything wrong with Willow Creek's infrastructure planning. Originally designed for horse-drawn delivery wagons in 1887, it had been converted to one-way vehicle access sometime in the 1950s without any consideration for modern traffic patterns. The result was a claustrophobic passage barely wide enough for a single car, hemmed in by brick walls on both sides, and ending in a sharp turn that led nowhere except back to Main Street. Rodney Fleming stood at the alley's mouth at 11:47 p.m., using the darkness to conduct what intelligence professionals called a site survey. His penlight revealed details that would be crucial for operational planning. The crumbling concrete surface that would amplify the sound of a racing engine, the blind corner that eliminated sight lines, and most importantly, the storm drain system that had been installed during the 1990s but never properly maintained. 3 weeks of research had revealed that Willow Creek's municipal infrastructure existed in a state of barely controlled decay. Budget constraints and political corruption had combined to create a public works department that specialized in cosmetic repairs while ignoring systemic problems. The storm drain network was a perfect example. Impressive on paper, but catastrophically unreliable in practice. More specifically, the drainage system beneath this particular alley contained a fatal flaw that would become critically important on the night when Benjamin Yates finally faced consequences for his actions. Rodney's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Rusty Anchor. Corner booth. Come alone. The message was from Deputy Van Andrews, who'd finally decided to take advantage of their previous conversation. Rodney pocketed his phone and took one last look at the alley, mentally cataloging angles and distances with the same precision he'd once applied to presidential motorcade routes. The Rusty Anchor occupied a converted farmhouse 2 miles outside town, its gravel parking lot filled with pickup trucks and motorcycles belonging to people who preferred to drink away from the oversight of polite society. The interior was dimly lit and thick with cigarette smoke, creating the kind of atmosphere where conversations could disappear in a background noise. Deputy Van Andrews sat in the corner booth as promised, still wearing his uniform but with his service weapon secured in a locked box beside him, a gesture that indicated both trust and vulnerability. His face was pale in the neon light from the beer signs, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped his coffee cup. "Mr. Fleming," Van said as Rodney slid into the opposite seat. "Thanks for coming. You sounded like you needed to talk." Van nodded, then glanced around the bar to ensure they weren't being observed. When he spoke, his voice carried the particular strain of someone who'd been carrying a heavy burden for too long. "I've been a deputy for 4 years," he began. "Came here straight out of the academy because I wanted to serve my community, you know? Protect and serve, all that idealistic bullshit." Rodney remained silent, recognizing the prelude to a confession. "I thought Sheriff Yates was a good man. Experienced, respected, effective at keeping crime rates down. Took me about 6 months to realize why the crime rates were so low. Why is that? Because half the crimes never get reported and the other half disappear before they reach the prosecutor's office." Van's grip tightened on his coffee cup. "You want to know how many sexual assault complaints we've received in the past 2 years? 14. You want to know how many made it to trial? 0. The statistics confirmed what Rodney had already suspected, but hearing them from an inside source added crucial details to his operational picture. All dismissed, withdrawn, dismissed, lost due to procedural errors, evidence contaminated, you name it. And every single one involved Benjamin Yates or his friends. Van reached into his jacket and produced a manila folder, sliding it across the table with the careful movements of someone handling explosives. "I've been documenting everything. Dates, times, case numbers, witnesses who suddenly became unavailable. I was going to take it to the state police, but last month, Deputy Joel Ferris tried to file a formal complaint about evidence tampering. 3 days later, he was arrested for possession of methamphetamine that somehow ended up in his patrol car. He's in federal prison now, swearing he was set up. The message was clear. Sheriff Yates possessed the ability to destroy anyone who threatened his operation, including his own deputies. Van Andrews was risking his career and possibly his freedom by sharing this information. Why are you telling me this? Rodney asked. Van was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if searching for answers in the dark liquid. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible above the bar's background noise. Because I became a cop to protect people like your daughter. And right now, I'm part of a system that's failing her and every other victim in this county. He looked up, meeting Rodney's eyes with desperate intensity. I can't fight this alone, Mr. Fleming. I don't have the resources or the connections. But maybe together. The offer was exactly what Rodney had hoped for, a law enforcement insider willing to provide intelligence and tactical support. But it also represented a significant escalation in risk for both of them. Once Van Andrews crossed the line from passive observer to active participant, there would be no returning to his previous position. What exactly are you proposing, Deputy? I'm proposing that Benjamin Yates finally faces real consequences for his actions. I'm proposing that his father learns he can't protect him forever. And I'm proposing that this county gets the justice system it deserves instead of the protection racket it currently has. Rodney studied the young deputy's face, reading the mixture of fear and determination that characterized people who'd reached their breaking point. Van Andrews was ready to act, but he needed direction and support from someone with operational experience. That's a dangerous proposition, Deputy. Are you prepared for where it might lead? Mr. Fleming, I've watched Benjamin Yates assault 3 different women in the past year. I've seen evidence disappear, witnesses intimidated, and victims driven out of town to protect a predator. I'm already living with danger, the danger of being complicit in everything I became a cop to prevent. The folder between them represented more than just documentation. It was a declaration of war against a corrupt system. Rodney understood that accepting Van's offer would commit him to a course of action with only 2 possible outcomes: total victory or complete destruction. I'll need time to review this information, he said finally. Of course, but Mr. Fleming. Van leaned forward, lowering his voice to barely above a whisper. Whatever you're planning, it needs to happen soon. Benjamin's getting bolder, and his father's getting more desperate to protect him. The next victim might not survive to tell her story. As Rodney drove home through the empty streets of Willow Creek, the deputy's files on the passenger seat represented both opportunity and obligation. Van Andrews had provided the final piece of intelligence he needed to move from planning to execution. More importantly, he'd offered active collaboration from within the sheriff's department, access that would be crucial for the operation's success. But the most significant development of the evening hadn't been Van's offer of partnership. It had been his warning about Benjamin's escalating behavior. Rodney's research had already identified a pattern of increasingly serious crimes, but Van's insider perspective suggested that the timeline for intervention was shorter than anticipated. Benjamin Yates was approaching the psychological breaking point that transformed serial predators into killers. His father's protection had insulated him from consequences for so long that he'd lost the ability to recognize limits or control impulses. The next assault wouldn't just be another crime to cover up. It would be the incident that finally brought federal attention to Willow Creek County. Unless someone intervened first. Rodney parked in his driveway and sat in the darkness for several minutes, weighing the ethical implications of what he was contemplating. His Secret Service training had included extensive instruction in legal boundaries and constitutional limits. What he was planning would violate numerous federal laws and professional codes. But his daughter's broken arm served as a constant reminder that traditional legal remedies had already failed. Sheriff Reginald Yates had demonstrated his ability to manipulate the justice system with impunity, and Benjamin's escalating violence threatened not just the Fleming family, but every vulnerable person in the county. Sometimes justice required methods that wouldn't be found in any law enforcement manual. Inside the house, Joanne was waiting in the kitchen with a cup of tea and the kind of expression that indicated she'd been doing her own thinking about their situation. "How was your evening?" she asked with carefully neutral tone. "Productive. I think I've found some people who share our concerns about Benjamin Yates. People in positions to do something about it. Potentially." Joanne nodded slowly, processing the implications. She'd been married to a federal agent long enough to understand the difference between official channels and unofficial solutions. And what would doing something about it involve? The question cut to the heart of everything. Rodney had spent 3 weeks gathering intelligence and building a network of potential allies, but he hadn't yet shared his operational plans with his wife. Part of him wanted to protect her from knowledge that could make her legally complicit. Another part recognized that she deserved to understand the risks their family would be assuming. It would involve ensuring that Benjamin Yates faces consequences for his actions, he said carefully. Real consequences that his father can't undo or manipulate. Legal consequences? Justice doesn't always come through courtrooms, Joanne. Sometimes it requires more direct approaches. She was quiet for a long moment, sipping her tea while she considered his words. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same steady resolve that had sustained their marriage through 15 years of classified operations. What do you need from me? The simple question contained worlds of trust and commitment. Joanne Fleming was offering her complete support for whatever course of action her husband deemed necessary, despite understanding that it would likely involve breaking laws and taking risks that could destroy their family. "I need you to trust me," Rodney said. "And I need you to be ready to move quickly if things go wrong. Like we did in Prague." The reference was to a 2019 incident when a credible assassination threat had required the Fleming family to disappear from their hotel in less than 6 minutes. They practiced emergency evacuation procedures until they could pack their essential belongings and reach a secure location in under 4 minutes, a skill set that might prove relevant in the coming weeks. Something like that. Joanne finished her tea and stood, her movements carrying the purposeful efficiency of someone shifting into operational mode. "Then we'd better make sure things don't go wrong." As they turned off the kitchen lights and headed upstairs, Rodney felt the familiar sensation of crossing a point of no return. Tomorrow, he would begin implementing the plan that had been forming in his mind for the past 3 weeks. There would be no more surveillance or preparation, only action and consequences. Benjamin Yates had broken his daughter's arm as a demonstration of power. Soon, he would learn that demonstrations of power worked both ways. But first, Rodney needed to prepare the perfect storm that would wash through Willow Creek County like a cleansing flood, carrying away everything corrupt and leaving only justice in its wake. Chapter 6. Pressure Points. The text message arrived at Caitlin Berger's phone at 2:17 a.m., jolting her awake in her small apartment above Henley's hardware store. The sender was listed as anonymous, but the content was specific enough to make her blood run cold. Check case file C, 2024-1127 tomorrow morning. Evidence locker 47B. Document everything before it disappears like the others. Caitlin sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the message while her mind raced through the implications. Someone knew about her growing concerns regarding irregularities in the court system. More troubling, someone knew enough about case management procedures to identify specific files and evidence locations. But most unsettling of all, the message implied that evidence was actively being destroyed, a federal crime that could bring down the entire sheriff's department if properly documented. At 6:45 a.m., Caitlin arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes before her scheduled shift, using her access codes to enter the records room while the building was still largely empty. Case file C, 2024-1127 corresponded to a sexual assault complaint filed 6 weeks earlier by a 19-year-old college student named Heidi Higgins. According to the initial police report, Heidi had accused Benjamin Yates of assault following a party at his family's property. The file should have contained witness statements, medical records, and physical evidence collected during the investigation. Instead, Caitlin found 3 pages of paperwork and a notation that the complainant had withdrawn her allegations due to memory inconsistencies related to voluntary intoxication. Evidence locker 47B told a different story. The metal storage box contained items that should have been processed weeks ago: torn clothing, DNA samples, and a digital camera with images that clearly contradicted the official narrative. Most damning was a signed witness statement from Carlos Allison, Benjamin's friend, describing the assault in graphic detail and expressing concern for the victim's welfare. Caitlin used her phone to photograph every piece of evidence, understanding that she was documenting proof of systematic obstruction of justice. The evidence should have been processed through state crime lab facilities and presented to a grand jury. Instead, it had been buried in a storage locker where it would eventually be destroyed according to routine retention schedules. Her hand was shaking as she returned the evidence to its container. The anonymous message had provided her with exactly what she needed to expose the corruption she'd suspected for months. But it had also made her an active participant in whatever larger operation was unfolding. At 8:30 a.m., her phone buzzed with another message. Murphy's gas station parking lot. 12:15 p.m. Come alone. Bring copies. 3 miles away, Carlos Allison was experiencing his own crisis of conscience in the maintenance shed behind the county courthouse. He'd arrived early for his shift, hoping to find some peace in routine work, but instead found himself staring at a manila envelope that had been slipped under the door sometime during the night. Inside the envelope were photocopies of his own witness statement, the one he'd given to Deputy Van Andrews immediately after Heidi Higgins' assault. The statement he'd been told was lost due to a filing error. The statement that could have prevented Benjamin Yates from hurting other women. A handwritten note was paperclipped to the documents. Your grandmother raised you to do what's right. This is your chance to honor her memory. 12:30 p.m. Murphy's gas station. Time to choose who you want to be. Carlos felt sick as he read his own words describing Benjamin's violence and his failure to intervene. He'd written the truth in a moment of conscience, hoping that his testimony might bring justice for Heidi. When Deputy Andrews told him the statement had been lost, Carlos had felt relief rather than disappointment. Relief that he wouldn't have to testify against the sheriff's son. Now someone was offering him a second chance to do the right thing. But Carlos understood that accepting that chance would make him an enemy of the most powerful family in Willow Creek County. At noon, Rodney Fleming sat in his truck in Murphy's gas station parking lot, watching both approaches to the building while reviewing his operational timeline. Phase 2 of his plan required converting passive intelligence sources into active participants, but the transition from observer to collaborator always carried significant risks. Caitlin Berger arrived first, driving a 10-year-old Honda Civic and glancing nervously around the parking lot before approaching his truck. She slid into the passenger seat with the careful movements of someone expecting ambush, her purse clutched protectively against her chest. You sent the messages, she said. It wasn't a question. I sent them. How did you know about the evidence locker? I know a lot of things, Miss Berger. The question is what you plan to do with the information you've gathered. Caitlin reached into her purse and produced a flash drive. I documented everything, but I need to understand what I'm getting involved in before I go any further. You're getting involved in justice. Real justice for victims who've been denied legal remedies through official channels. That sounds like vigilante rhetoric. Rodney studied her face, reading the mixture of fear and determination that characterized people standing at ethical crossroads. What would you call it when evidence of felony assault is buried in storage lockers? When witness statements disappear to protect politically connected criminals? When victims are driven out of town to maintain the fiction of law and order? Corruption, Caitlin replied quietly. Exactly. And corruption requires more than documentation. It requires direct action by people willing to accept the risks of opposing entrenched power. Through the truck's rear window, Rodney watched Carlos Allison pull into the parking lot in his grandmother's aging Buick. The young man sat behind the wheel for several minutes, clearly wrestling with the decision to proceed. That's Carlos, Caitlin observed. He works maintenance at the courthouse. He also witnessed Benjamin Yates assault Heidi Higgins. His testimony could have prevented what happened to every subsequent victim. Including your daughter? Including my daughter. Carlos finally emerged from the Buick and approached the truck with the hesitant gait of someone walking toward his own execution. He climbed into the back seat and immediately began talking, the words spilling out in a rush of guilt and desperation. I should have done more, he said. When I saw what Benjamin did to that girl, I should have called 911 myself instead of just giving a statement to the deputy. I should have found some way to help her instead of just watching and writing it down later. You can help her now, Rodney replied. You can help all of them. How? Sheriff Yates owns the whole county. He can make evidence disappear, intimidate witnesses, destroy anyone who opposes him. What chance do we have against that kind of power? Rodney turned in his seat to face both of his passengers. We have 3 things that Sheriff Yates doesn't expect: inside information about his operations, documented evidence of systematic corruption, and most importantly, the element of surprise. He opened a folder on his lap, revealing a detailed operational plan that had been weeks in the making. The documents included maps, timelines, and contingency procedures that would have been familiar to anyone who'd worked classified operations. Sheriff Yates believes his power is absolute because he's never faced organized opposition. Rodney continued. He's built his protection of Benjamin on the assumption that individual victims and witnesses can be isolated and neutralized. But coordinated action by multiple sources can overwhelm his ability to control the narrative. Caitlin leaned forward, studying the documents with professional interest. This looks like a military operation. It is a military operation. Specifically, it's a targeted disruption campaign designed to expose corruption and deliver justice through unconventional means. Unconventional means? Carlos asked nervously. Legal remedies have failed because Sheriff Yates controls the local justice system. Federal intervention is too slow to prevent additional victims. That leaves us with the option of creating consequences through other channels. Rodney closed the folder and looked at each of his passengers in turn. I'm offering you both the chance to be part of ensuring that Benjamin Yates finally faces real consequences for his actions. But I need to know right now whether you're prepared for what that means. What does it mean? Caitlin asked. It means that in approximately 72 hours, Benjamin Yates will take a wrong turn down a one-way alley and never come out. It means that his father will learn that power has limits when it confronts superior planning and execution. And it means that Willow Creek County will finally have the justice system it deserves. The truck fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic on Route 47. Rodney could see both passengers processing the implications of what he described. Neither seemed shocked by the revelation. Their experiences with the Yates family's corruption had prepared them for the possibility of extreme measures. You're talking about murder, Carlos said finally. I'm talking about consequences. Benjamin Yates has assaulted at least 14 women, broken my daughter's arm, and will continue escalating his violence until someone stops him permanently. His father has demonstrated that legal justice is impossible. That leaves us with natural justice. Caitlin was quiet for a long moment, staring through the windshield at the gas station where ordinary people conducted ordinary business, unaware that they were witnessing a planning session for an operation that would reshape their community. If we do this, she said slowly, if we help you, what happens afterward? Afterward, Sheriff Reginald Yates loses his protection of his son and faces federal investigation for the corruption we've documented. Afterward, the evidence you've preserved becomes part of a larger case that brings down his entire operation. Afterward, women in this county can report sexual assault without fear that their cases will disappear. And Benjamin? Benjamin takes a drive he won't come back from. Carlos leaned forward, his voice barely audible. What do you need us to do? Rodney smiled for the first time since the meeting began. Both of his assets had made their decisions, crossing the line from passive observers to active participants in an operation that would require courage, precision, and absolute commitment to seeing justice delivered. I need you to trust me, he said, and I need you to be ready to move when I give the signal. As Caitlin and Carlos returned to their vehicles, Rodney remained in the parking lot reviewing his operational timeline. Phase 2 was complete. He'd successfully recruited the inside sources necessary for the operation's success. Phase 3 would require more direct action, but first he needed to have one final conversation with his primary asset within the sheriff's department. Deputy Van Andrews was about to learn that his offer of partnership came with obligations that extended far beyond passive intelligence sharing. Sometimes justice required people to make choices that would define the rest of their lives. Tomorrow night, everyone involved in Rodney Fleming's operation would discover exactly what kind of people they really were. Chapter 7. The Trap is Set. The storm clouds building over Willow Creek County matched the tension that had been accumulating for weeks beneath the surface of small-town normalcy. Meteorologists predicted the first major thunderstorm of the season would arrive by midnight, bringing with it the kind of flooding that had plagued the area's inadequate drainage system since the 1990s infrastructure upgrades. But Rodney Fleming's attention wasn't focused on the weather forecast. At 4:47 p.m., he stood in Fleming's auto repair reviewing the final details of an operation that would begin in less than 8 hours. Every component had been tested, every variable accounted for, every participant briefed on their specific role in what would appear to be a tragic accident caused by reckless driving and municipal negligence. The key to the entire operation lay in understanding Benjamin Yates' psychological profile. 3 weeks of surveillance had revealed that the sheriff's son followed predictable patterns when under stress. He drove aggressively, sought validation through displays of wealth and power, and invariably ended up at Mulligan's Bar on Friday nights when his regular social circle became unavailable. Tonight, his regular social circle would be deliberately unavailable. Rodney's phone buzzed with a text message from Carlos Allison. "Benjamin just called. I told him I'm sick and can't hang out tonight. He seemed pissed but said he'd find something else to do." The message confirmed that Phase 1 of the evening's operation was proceeding according to plan. Carlos had been Benjamin's most reliable companion for weekend entertainment, which meant his sudden unavailability would force the sheriff's son to seek alternative social outlets. The psychological pressure would be increased by similar rejections from his other regular associates, all of whom had been approached through carefully orchestrated channels. By 9 p.m., Benjamin Yates would be angry, frustrated, and looking for ways to assert his dominance over a world that suddenly seemed to be denying him the deference he considered his birthright. In that mindset, he would be particularly susceptible to the specific type of provocation that Rodney had arranged. At 6:15 p.m., Deputy Van Andrews arrived at Fleming's auto repair in his personal vehicle, having volunteered to work a double shift that would place him in the perfect position to respond to emergency calls in the downtown area. His face was pale but determined as he climbed out of his pickup truck, carrying the burden of someone who'd agreed to actions that would change everything. "Second thoughts?" Rodney asked as they walked into the garage bay. "About a dozen. But every time I start to reconsider, I think about Heidi Higgins and all the other women Benjamin has hurt." Van's jaw tightened. "How many more victims do we allow while we wait for a system that will never deliver justice?" "None," Rodney replied simply. "After tonight, Benjamin Yates stops being a threat to anyone." Van nodded, then pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. "I drew up the emergency response timeline, like you requested. First responders will be directed to the alley entrance on Jefferson Street. The ambulance route from there to the hospital takes approximately 12 minutes, depending on traffic. And the medical examiner? Dr. Reginald Combs handles all suspicious deaths in the county. He's been sheriff's personal friend for 20 years, which means he'll be motivated to find accidental causes rather than investigate too deeply." The information confirmed Rodney's assessment of the local power structure. Even in death, Benjamin Yates would benefit from his father's influence, which made it crucial that the circumstances appear completely accidental. "What about the storm drain system?" Van consulted his notes. Public Works confirmed that the drainage system in that area is severely compromised. Heavy rainfall causes flooding that can make the alley impassable within 15 minutes. They've been planning repairs for 2 years, but haven't secured funding. "Perfect." At 7:30 p.m., Caitlin Berger sent a text message confirming her own readiness. All evidence photographed and uploaded to secure server. Ready to submit formal complaint to FBI field office in Kansas City first thing Monday morning. The timing was crucial. Caitlin's evidence of systematic corruption within the sheriff's department would provide federal authorities with justification for a comprehensive investigation. But that investigation needed to begin after Benjamin's death, not before, to ensure that the focus remained on exposing corruption rather than preventing a tragedy that would already be concluded. As darkness settled over Willow Creek, Rodney made his final preparations. The operation's success depended on precise timing and flawless execution, but it also required that he personally assume the greatest risk. If anything went wrong, if any detail was overlooked, he would be the one facing federal charges for conspiracy and murder. But as he looked at the photograph of Melody's broken arm that he kept on his workbench, Rodney felt only cold certainty. Benjamin Yates had demonstrated his willingness to hurt innocent people for his own amusement. His father had proven that official justice was impossible. That left only the kind of justice that Rodney Fleming was uniquely qualified to deliver. At 8:45 p.m., the final phase of the operation began. Rodney drove his pickup truck to Mulligan's Bar, a tavern on the outskirts of town where Benjamin Yates had been drinking alone for the past hour. The young man's Mustang GT sat in the parking lot like a predator waiting to strike, its engine modifications clearly visible even in the dim light from the bar's neon signs. Inside, Benjamin was working on his fourth whiskey and growing increasingly agitated by the evening's series of social rejections. His usual confidence had been replaced by the ugly mood of someone accustomed to getting his way who suddenly found himself isolated and ignored. Rodney ordered a beer and positioned himself at the opposite end of the bar, close enough to observe but far enough away to avoid immediate recognition. He didn't have to wait long for an opportunity to implement the final provocation. At 9:23 p.m., Benjamin's phone rang. The call was from a number he didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. Heidi Higgins, the college student he'd assaulted 6 weeks earlier. What Benjamin didn't know was that Heidi was reading from a script that Rodney had carefully prepared, and that her call was being made from a secure location 3 states away, where she was now attending school under an assumed name. "Benjamin, this is Heidi. I need to talk to you." The color drained from Benjamin's face as he recognized the voice of the woman whose assault complaint had mysteriously disappeared from the court system. "Heidi, how did you get this number? I never forgot what you did to me, Benjamin. And I never forgot how your father made my life hell until I had to leave town." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. And now I'm ready to tell the truth about that night. I'm calling reporters, Benjamin. I'm calling the FBI. I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you really are." Benjamin's grip tightened on his phone, his knuckles whitening with rage. "You can't prove anything. Nobody will believe you." "I have proof, Benjamin. More proof than you can imagine. And starting Monday morning, everyone in Willow Creek is going to know what you did to me and all the other women." The call ended, leaving Benjamin staring at his phone in shock and growing panic. Rodney watched from across the bar as the sheriff's son drained his whiskey and began making agitated phone calls. First to his father, then to several associates, all of whom either didn't answer or provided responses that only increased his desperation. At 10:47 p.m., Benjamin Yates stumbled out of Mulligan's Bar and climbed into his Mustang GT. His intoxication level was well above the legal limit. His emotional state was completely compromised, and his destination was inevitably going to be the downtown area, where he would attempt to find someone to intimidate or assault as a way of reasserting his dominance. Rodney followed at a discreet distance, watching as Benjamin's driving became increasingly reckless. The young man was racing through residential neighborhoods at twice the speed limit, running stop signs, and clearly looking for trouble that would allow him to release his building rage. At 11:34 p.m., Benjamin's Mustang skidded to a stop outside the courthouse, where a group of teenagers was walking home from a movie at the downtown theater. Rodney watched from a block away as Benjamin climbed out of his car and began harassing the group, clearly intending to find a victim who would restore his sense of power and control. But before Benjamin could escalate his behavior, Deputy Van Andrews appeared in his patrol car, responding to a routine disturbance call that had been placed from an anonymous phone. "Evening, Benjamin," Van said as he approached the group. "These folks giving you trouble?" The question was carefully phrased to suggest that the teenagers were the problem rather than Benjamin himself. But it also served notice that law enforcement was present and observing, which forced Benjamin to modify his behavior. "Just talking to some friends, Deputy," Benjamin replied with forced casualness. "Well, maybe it's time everyone headed home. Looks like we've got some weather moving in." The teenagers needed no encouragement to escape, disappearing quickly into the night while Benjamin was left standing alone beside his car. Van's intervention had prevented an assault, but it had also increased Benjamin's frustration to the breaking point. "You should probably call in night 2, Benjamin," Van suggested. "Roads are going to get dangerous once this storm hits." Benjamin's response was exactly what Rodney had predicted: rage at being denied his victim, combined with alcohol-fueled defiance of authority, even when that authority was nominally on his side. "Don't tell me what to do," Benjamin snapped. "I'll drive wherever I want, whenever I want." He climbed back into his Mustang and gunned the engine, his tires leaving black marks on the asphalt as he accelerated away from the courthouse. Van watched him go, then looked directly at Rodney's location and nodded once, a signal that Phase 3 was complete. Benjamin Yates was now driving drunk, angry, and reckless through downtown Willow Creek during the early stages of a severe thunderstorm. The only remaining question was which route he would choose for his final journey. At 11:52 p.m., Rodney's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, taking Jefferson Street toward Maine. ETA 4 minutes. The message was from Carlos Allison, who was positioned at a strategic observation point downtown. Despite his fears about participating in the operation, Carlos had volunteered for surveillance duty, understanding that his grandmother's memory demanded that he choose the side of justice. Rodney started his truck and began driving toward the alley that would become Benjamin Yates' final destination. As he drove, the first drops of rain began hitting his windshield, and thunder rumbled in the distance like the sound of approaching artillery. Everything was proceeding according to plan. In 6 minutes, justice would finally arrive in Willow Creek County, and Benjamin Yates would learn that some wrong turns led to places from which there was no return. Chapter 8. Point of No Return. The rain was falling harder now, turning the streets of downtown Willow Creek into a mirror-black maze that reflected the streetlights like fallen stars. At 11:58 p.m., Rodney Fleming sat in his truck at the mouth of the alley behind Murphy's gas station, watching the storm transform the narrow passage into exactly the kind of death trap he'd envisioned 3 weeks earlier. Water was already beginning to pool in the low spots where the concrete had cracked, and the storm drain system, compromised by years of deferred maintenance, was producing the ominous gurgling sounds that preceded complete failure. Within 20 minutes, the alley would be impassable due to flooding. But Benjamin Yates would encounter his destiny long before the water reached dangerous levels. Rodney's phone vibrated with incoming messages from his operational team. Carlos Allison, target vehicle spotted on Jefferson Street. Driving erratic, speed approximately 50 in 25 zone. Deputy Van Andrews, emergency response team standing by. Ambulance ETA will be 12 to 15 minutes from initial call. Caitlin Berger, evidence package ready for federal submission. Will transmit Monday morning as scheduled. The final phase of a 3-week operation was beginning. In his previous career, Rodney had executed similar plans to protect presidents from assassination attempts, but never before had he been the architect of lethal action rather than its prevention. The moral weight of that distinction had kept him awake for the past 72 hours, but watching Melody struggle with her physical therapy had reminded him why some situations demanded extreme solutions. Benjamin Yates' Mustang GT appeared through the rain at exactly midnight, its headlights cutting through the darkness as it rounded the corner onto Main Street. Even from a distance, Rodney could see that the vehicle was traveling far too fast for the wet conditions, its tires struggling to maintain traction on the increasingly slick pavement. The trap he'd prepared was elegant in its simplicity. Benjamin would encounter what appeared to be a stalled vehicle blocking the main route through downtown, forcing him to choose between turning around, which his psychological profile suggested he would never do when angry, or taking the detour that led to the one-way alley. Rodney started his truck and drove to his designated position, parking his vehicle at an angle that would block normal traffic flow while appearing to be the result of mechanical failure. He raised the hood and positioned himself beside the engine bay, playing the role of a stranded motorist dealing with car trouble on an unfortunate night. Benjamin's reaction was immediate and predictable. The Mustang skidded to a stop 20 feet away, its engine revving with unnecessary aggression as Benjamin leaned on his horn in a display of entitled rage. Through the rain-streaked windshield, Rodney could see the young man's face twisted with fury at this latest obstruction to his will. "Move your piece of shit truck," Benjamin shouted through his lowered window. "You're blocking the road." Rodney looked up from his engine bay with the patient expression of someone dealing with a drunk fool. "Sorry, friend." Engine died right in the middle of the street. "Tow truck's on the way, but might be a while in this weather." "I don't care about your problems. Move it now, or I'll move it for you." The threat was delivered with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. Rodney recognized the particular brand of entitlement that came from 20 years of having problems solved by parental influence rather than personal responsibility. "Wish I could help you, but she's not starting," Rodney replied with a shrug. "There's a detour around the block if you're in a hurry." Benjamin's response was a string of profanity that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so predictable. He gunned his engine and executed a sharp U-turn, his rear tires sliding dangerously on the wet pavement as he accelerated toward the detour route that would take him down Jefferson Street to the alley entrance. Rodney watched the Mustang's taillights disappear around the corner, then immediately closed his hood and climbed back into his truck. Phase 4 was complete. Benjamin Yates was now committed to the route that would lead him to his final destination. But as Rodney prepared to move to his next position, his phone rang with an unexpected call that threatened to derail the entire operation. "Mr. Fleming? This is Sheriff Reginald Yates." The voice was slurred with alcohol and thick with desperation, suggesting that the sheriff had been drinking heavily while dealing with the evening's accumulating crises. Rodney's trap had included psychological pressure on Benjamin's father, as well as the son, and it appeared that pressure was finally taking its toll. "Sheriff, what can I do for you?" "I need to ask you a question, Mr. Fleming, and I need you to answer honestly." The pause that followed was filled with the sound of rain and distant thunder. "Are you the one who's been fucking with my family?" The question was direct and dangerous, indicating that Sheriff Yates possessed more awareness of the operation than Rodney had anticipated. But it also revealed desperation and loss of control, exactly the psychological state that would prevent effective countermeasures. "I'm not sure what you mean, Sheriff. Don't play games with me." Benjamin's friends suddenly can't hang out with him. Witnesses are coming forward with evidence that should have been destroyed, and now my son is driving around town drunk and out of his mind because some bitch called him about things that never happened. The admission was damning and would have been useful evidence in a federal investigation. But more immediately, it confirmed that every element of Rodney's psychological manipulation had achieved its intended effect. "Sounds like your son's having a rough night. You think this is funny? You think you could destroy my family and walk away? I own this town, Mr. Fleming. I own every judge, every prosecutor, every federal contact who might investigate my department. Whatever you're planning, it ends tonight." The threat was delivered with conviction, but Rodney could hear the underlying panic in Sheriff Yates' voice. The man was losing control of a situation he'd never fully understood, and his desperation was making him careless. "Sheriff, I think you've been drinking. Maybe you should. Maybe I should what? Maybe I should let you destroy everything I've built? Maybe I should let you turn my son into some kind of scapegoat for your own failures as a father." The personal attack was designed to provoke an emotional response, but Rodney's operational training had taught him to remain focused on objectives rather than react to insults. While Sheriff Yates was making threats over the phone, his son was driving toward an appointment with natural justice. "Sheriff, I need to get my truck off the road before someone gets hurt in this storm. We can discuss your concerns tomorrow when you're in a better frame of mind." "There won't be a tomorrow for this conversation, Mr. Fleming. After tonight, you're going to discover what happens to people who threaten the Yates family." The line went dead, leaving Rodney alone with the sound of rain drumming against his windshield and the knowledge that Sheriff Yates was planning some form of immediate retaliation. But as he considered the implications of the call, Rodney realized that the sheriff's threats were actually evidence of the operation's success. Reginald Yates was scared. For the first time in 20 years, he was facing opposition that he couldn't control through intimidation or corruption. His son was spiraling out of control, His protection network was being exposed by federal quality documentation, and his enemies possessed inside information about his operations. In trying to prevent his family's destruction, Sheriff Yates was ensuring that it happened exactly as Rodney had planned. At 12:17 a.m., Carlos Allison sent the crucial update: target vehicle entering alley from Jefferson Street, proceeding slowly due to water accumulation. Rodney started his truck and drove toward his final observation position, a parking lot that provided clear sight lines to the alley's entrance while maintaining plausible deniability for his presence. Through the rain, he could see the Mustang's headlights penetrating the darkness between the brick walls that lined the narrow passage. Benjamin Yates was now inside the trap, committed to a route that offered no escape and no alternatives. The storm drain failure that Rodney had anticipated was beginning to manifest as water from the surrounding area collected in the alley's low-lying concrete basin. What happened next would appear to be a tragic accident caused by drunk driving, poor weather conditions, and municipal negligence. The reality would be far more complex, but reality was less important than the official narrative that would emerge from the subsequent investigation. Deputy Van Andrews was already in position to respond to the emergency call. Caitlin Berger's evidence would provide federal investigators with justification for dismantling Sheriff Yates' corrupt network. And Carlos Allison's witness testimony would ensure that Benjamin's history of violence became part of the public record. But first, Benjamin Yates had to take the final wrong turn that would end his career as a predator and begin his father's journey toward federal prison. At 12:19 a.m., the sound of a racing engine echoed through the alley, followed immediately by the squeal of brakes and the sickening crunch of metal meeting immovable concrete. The impact was followed by a moment of absolute silence, then the hiss of steam rising from a destroyed radiator. Rodney closed his eyes and felt the weight of 15 years' worth of classified operations settling across his shoulders like a familiar coat. Justice had finally arrived in Willow Creek County, and Benjamin Yates would never hurt anyone again. Chapter 9. Justice Served. The emergency response vehicles arrived at the alley entrance 17 minutes after Deputy Van Andrews called in the accident, their red and blue lights painting the brick walls in colors that reminded Rodney Fleming of old crime scene photographs. From his observation position across the street, he watched the choreographed dance of first responders working to extract Benjamin Yates from what remained of his Mustang GT. The crash scene was exactly what he'd envisioned 3 weeks earlier. A high-performance vehicle traveling too fast on wet pavement had lost control in the narrow alley and struck the concrete storm drain outlet with devastating force. The impact had compressed the Mustang's front end by nearly 4 feet, and the subsequent fire had been mercifully brief but thorough enough to complicate forensic analysis. By 1:15 a.m., the medical examiner had completed his preliminary assessment and declared Benjamin Yates dead at the scene. Dr. Reginald Combs, Sheriff Yates' longtime friend, moved through his examination with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd processed dozens of similar traffic fatalities over the years. Single vehicle accident, Dr. Combs announced to the assembled officers. Driver appears to have been intoxicated, lost control on wet pavement, and struck the drainage structure at high speed. Death was instantaneous. Rodney felt no satisfaction at the announcement, only the cold certainty that a necessary task had been completed. Benjamin Yates' death would spare unknown numbers of future victims, but it also represented the failure of every institution that should have prevented the need for such extreme measures. Sheriff Reginald Yates arrived at 1:23 a.m., his unmarked cruiser skidding to a stop behind the ambulance in a spray of rainwater and gravel. Rodney watched through his truck's rain-streaked windshield as the sheriff stumbled toward the crash site with the unsteady gait of a man whose world had just collapsed around him. The scene that followed was both tragic and inevitable. Sheriff Yates fell to his knees beside his son's body, his powerful frame shaking with sobs that carried across the crime scene like the sound of breaking glass. For a moment, he was no longer the corrupt politician who'd terrorized Willow Creek County for 12 years. He was simply a father confronting the death of his child. But even grief couldn't prevent Sheriff Yates from recognizing that his son's death was more than a simple accident. As he raised his head from Benjamin's covered form, his eyes swept the assembled officers and emergency personnel with the paranoid intensity of someone who understood that his enemies were closer than they appeared. "This wasn't an accident," he announced to the crime scene. "My son didn't just lose control and crash. Someone arranged this. Someone planned it." Deputy Van Andrews approached his superior with the careful movements of someone defusing an explosive device. "Sheriff, I know this is difficult, but the evidence is pretty clear. Benjamin was drinking at Mulligan's bar until after 11, and several witnesses saw him driving erratically downtown. The storm made road conditions dangerous, and this alley has been a known hazard for months. Evidence can be manufactured, Deputy. Witnesses can be coerced. This whole scene could have been staged by someone who wanted my son dead." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from the destroyed vehicle. Several officers exchanged uncomfortable glances, recognizing the signs of a superior officer's psychological breakdown, but uncertain how to respond. Dr. Combs cleared his throat diplomatically. "Sheriff, I understand your grief, but sometimes terrible accidents are just accidents. The physical evidence is consistent with high-speed impact following loss of vehicle control. Without clear indicators of foul play, I have to classify this as accidental death pending toxicology results." Sheriff Yates stood slowly, his face cycling through expressions of rage, desperation, and calculation. Rodney recognized the look of someone whose tactical situation had deteriorated beyond recovery, but who hadn't yet accepted the reality of defeat. "I want a full investigation," Sheriff Yates declared. "I want the state police involved. I want federal agents if necessary. Someone murder my son, and I'm going to find out who." The demand was both understandable and futile. Any serious investigation would ultimately expose the corruption that had protected Benjamin for years, creating more problems for Sheriff Yates than it solved. But grief and rage rarely produced rational decision-making, and the sheriff was operating purely on instinct now. As the crime scene began to wind down and Benjamin's body was loaded into the coroner's van, Rodney started his truck and drove home through the empty streets of Willow Creek. The storm was beginning to pass, leaving behind the clean smell of washed air and the promise of a new day. But the real storm was just beginning for Sheriff Reginald Yates. At 8:30 a.m. Monday morning, Caitlin Berger arrived at the FBI field office in Kansas City carrying a comprehensive evidence package that documented 3 years of systematic corruption within the Willow Creek County Sheriff's Department. Her timing was perfect. Benjamin's death had attracted media attention that made federal intervention both necessary and inevitable. Special Agent Joanne Lewis reviewed Caitlin's evidence with the experienced eye of someone who'd investigated dozens of similar corruption cases. The documentation was thorough, professional, and devastating in its implications for everyone involved in Sheriff Yates' protection network. "This is federal-level evidence tampering," Agent Lewis observed as she examined photographs of the evidence locker contents. "We're talking about systematic obstruction of justice, civil rights violations, and conspiracy charges. How long before you can act on it?" Caitlin asked. "We'll have search warrants by this afternoon and a task force operational by tomorrow morning. If this evidence is accurate, Sheriff Yates is looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison." By Tuesday morning, the Willow Creek County Courthouse was surrounded by FBI vehicles and federal agents executing simultaneous search warrants on the Sheriff's Department, the prosecutor's office, and 3 judges' chambers. The operation was coordinated with military precision and designed to prevent the destruction of evidence that had survived previous cover-up attempts. Sheriff Reginald Yates was arrested at his home at 6:45 a.m., charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice, civil rights violations, and operating a criminal enterprise under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The indictment included 14 counts of evidence tampering and witness intimidation, each carrying a potential sentence of up to 10 years in federal prison. The media coverage was extensive and damaging. National news outlets picked up the story of small-town corruption and its connection to the death of a sheriff's son, creating exactly the kind of scrutiny that made political protection impossible. Within 48 hours, 3 state legislators and a federal congressman had called for comprehensive reform of rural law enforcement oversight. But the most important outcome of the federal investigation was the validation it provided to Benjamin's victims. Heidi Higgins returned to Missouri to testify before a federal grand jury, her courage inspiring 2 other women to come forward with their own stories of assault and intimidation. The pattern of violence that had been hidden for years was finally exposed to public examination. 1 week after Benjamin's death, Rodney Fleming received a visit at his auto shop from Deputy Van Andrews, who had been promoted to interim sheriff pending federal oversight of the department's reorganization. "Federal prosecutors want to interview you as part of their investigation," Van said as they walked through the garage bay. "They're talking to everyone who had interactions with the Yates family." "What kind of questions?" "Standard stuff. Your observations of Benjamin's behavior, any evidence of intimidation or threats, your knowledge of corruption within the department." Van paused, studying Rodney's face with the intensity of someone who understood exactly what had really happened. "They're not treating you as a suspect, just a witness to the family's pattern of abuse." Rodney nodded, recognizing that his careful planning had created exactly the kind of plausible narrative that would survive federal scrutiny. His official role was that of a concerned citizen who documented corruption and provided evidence to appropriate authorities. The reality of his operational planning would remain forever classified within his own mind. "I'll cooperate fully with their investigation." "I figured you would." Van was quiet for a moment, watching Melody work on a transmission repair with the focused intensity she'd inherited from her father. "You know, there's been a remarkable improvement in public safety since Benjamin's death. Domestic violence reports are up 30%, which means women finally feel safe enough to seek help. Sexual assault cases are being processed through state crime labs instead of disappearing into evidence lockers." "That's good to hear." It's almost like someone removed a cancer from the community and allowed the healing process to begin. The comment was carefully neutral but loaded with implication. Van Andrews understood that justice had been served through unofficial channels, and he was expressing gratitude in the only way his position allowed. 6 months later, Reginald Yates was convicted on all federal charges and sentenced to 18 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. His conviction was followed by the successful prosecution of 3 judges, 2 prosecutors, and 7 additional law enforcement officers who had participated in his corruption network. The cleanup of Willow Creek County's justice system became a national model for federal intervention in local government corruption. New oversight procedures, reformed evidence handling protocols, and victim advocacy programs transformed an institution that had protected predators into one that actually served justice. But perhaps the most significant change was in the community itself. Citizens who had lived in fear of challenging authority began participating in local government and demanding accountability from their elected officials. The culture of intimidation and corruption that had defined Willow Creek County for over a decade was replaced by something resembling actual democracy. On a warm spring evening, exactly 1 year after Benjamin Yates' death, the Fleming family sat on their front porch watching Melody practice her pitching motion in the front yard. Her arm had healed completely, and she'd regained full strength through months of dedicated physical therapy. More importantly, she'd learned lessons about justice and moral courage that would serve her throughout her life. "Any regrets?" Joanne asked quietly as they watched their daughter's methodical practice routine. Rodney considered the question carefully. 14 women had been spared future assault because Benjamin Yates was no longer alive to hurt them. A corrupt sheriff was spending the rest of his life in federal prison instead of terrorizing his community. An entire county had been freed from a system that protected predators and punished victims. "None," he replied. As darkness settled over Willow Creek and the street lights began to illuminate the peaceful neighborhood, Rodney Fleming felt something he hadn't experienced since leaving federal service: the satisfaction of a mission accomplished and justice served. He'd used skills developed to protect presidents, to protect his own family and community, proving that sometimes the most important battles were fought not in foreign countries, but in small American towns where ordinary people needed extraordinary protection. Benjamin Yates had learned too late that some wrong turns led to places from which there was no return. His father had discovered that power without accountability was ultimately powerless when confronted by superior planning and execution. And Melody Fleming had inherited something more valuable than any government pension: the knowledge that when institutions fail to protect the innocent, individuals with the right skills and moral courage can ensure that justice prevails. The mechanic's reckoning was complete.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.